Bugs. You either love them, hate them, or hold a nuanced in-between opinion, like respecting them because they're important to the ecosystem and sometimes look cool while still preferring not to have them in your house or anywhere on your body. We all have our personal stories with bugs. For me, growing up in the relatively phylogenetically chill Midwest, I didn't have any real concerns with insects besides looking out for black widow spiders and wasps. I say real concerns though because even if an insect isn't dangerous, that doesn't mean they're not just scary looking sometimes. Personally, up until my late teens, I had pretty intense arachnophobia, even with small spiders. I'm glad to say I've mostly overcome it. In fact, I think I might have a couple spiders just chilling in the corners of my room right now. But when I was a kid, yikes. If there was a spider anywhere in the house, I was going to make it everyone's problem. It seemed that, to the dismay of my parents, the pro-spider propaganda of Miss Spider's Sunny Patch Friends did not make me any more tolerant of spiders in real life. In fact, I think the very first nightmare I ever had was actually me flying around as a butterfly and then getting lured into Miss Spider's treehouse under the promise of cranberry juice before she swathed me in her web so she could eat me later. I still kept watching the show though for some reason. Anyways, bugs in media. That's the topic of this video. And also a very convenient excuse for me to talk about some of my favorite games, movies, books, and insects. And if you clicked on this video, maybe some of yours too. The influence of insects on popular media is undeniable, especially when you know where to look. The most obvious example would be its use in character design, especially with the genres of science fiction and fantasy. It isn't surprising either. Insects are incredibly diverse in appearance and have some seriously interesting organs and appendages that help aid in their survival, which makes for great inspiration when developing a new race for a sci-fi or fantasy world. In fact, it's probably more refreshing too, since a lot of people can get annoyed with the trope of alien species or fantasy races just being some variation of tall blue skin or thin pointy ears. To be fair, the reason for that, at least in the past, usually had to do with budget and technological limitations, but yeah, unfortunately it did take a while for mainstream media to think a little more outside of the box. And what better way to do that than to take inspiration from strange and different creatures like insects? In science fiction, lots of alien designs tend to have features that are seen in insects like antennae, exoskeletons, large eyes, colorful hues, etc. Well, some of those features aren't necessarily exclusive to insects, but they are pretty common among them. In Alien, there are the xenomorphs. In Mass Effect, there are the Rachni. In Dungeons & Dragons, there are the Thrykean. In World of Warcraft, there are the Nerubians. And honestly, the examples are too many to list, but those were just some of the ones that I found the most influential and interesting to me personally. I will say though that most of these creatures exist within worlds that aren't really focused on insects in any other capacity, so discussion about their insect origins doesn't really go much beyond just creatives wanting to come up with an interesting looking species for their stories and world building, which is fine, but I honestly get more enjoyment learning about the insect inspirations in media that's more focused and invested in insects on a more fundamental level, like in Hollow Knight. Now, in terms of character design, the comparisons in this game aren't always one-to-one, and Hollow Knight definitely has its share of questionable choices. The most glaring one is Hornet being named Hornet. Even though she's canonically half spider and half hubris-driven protagonist of a Greek tragedy, somehow she ended up with the name Hornet. Despite this strange choice, still fits her surprisingly well. Hornets are powerful and aggressive insects, and Hornet is established pretty early on in the game as a dedicated and skilled warrior. But as for the other characters, there's a channel on YouTube called Mossbag that made a whole video on the real-world inspirations behind the bug designs of Hollow Knight. I'm basically going to give a mini version of that video right now, and if you're interested, I'll link that video in the description and you can go watch the whole thing later. If you're a seasoned Hollow Knight fan, you probably know that Hollow Knight's inception began with a Game Jam entry called Hungry Knight. Because the devs were limited to a 72-hour window, they needed to come up with characters for their entry that would be simple to design, yet still somewhat appealing and memorable. Taking inspiration from insects seemed to be their best option, so that's what they went with. And yeah, it makes sense. Bugs are really interesting looking and have lots of distinct features that make it easy to make simple but memorable designs for. After deciding to expand on Hungry Knight, well, more like deciding to completely overhaul it, they resolved to continue with the bug theme. Now, some of the bugs in Hollow Knight have pretty clear-cut real-life counterparts, like Marissa, Marmu, Bretta, Dung Defender, the Mantis Tribe, etc. However, the comparisons get a bit weaker with some of the other characters. In fact, some designs are pretty hard to track down an inspiration for at all, even though they do seem generally insect-adjacent. Others may generally resemble the real-life counterparts, but lack in other areas, which I credit mainly to the fact that A, the game also has a lot of fantasy elements, and B, as I said before, none of the creators were specifically that interested in insects. It just seemed like a good theme for the kind of game they wanted to make. For example, the queen bee in the hive is absolutely massive, but in real life, most queen bees are actually pretty normal sized, just with larger and longer abdomens. Honestly, at this point, my YouTube Shorts feed has recommended me so many beekeeping videos that I'd like to think that I'd still be able to pick out the queens on my own, but I'm probably just deluding myself. Also, I don't know if I'd ever be willing to dig around a hive with my bare hands the way some of those beekeepers do. But I digress. As for the Mantis Tribe, in the world of Hollow Knight, they're the most cohesive society in all of Hollow Nest, outlasting the Pale King's reign and even managing to evade the infection altogether. However, in real life, mantises are actually pretty antisocial, even eating each other on a semi-regular basis. I can't really blame the creators for the choices they made though. Sometimes insects just have really cool designs and you don't want to waste it on just some random enemy. Me personally, I've been fascinated with mantises since I was a kid. When most people hear the name mantis, they typically jump to thinking about the European praying mantis, which isn't surprising since they seem to be the most represented in pop culture. But mantises, or the Mantidea order, actually harbor a really interesting variety of creatures, many of whom are masters at mimicking their environments. They can blend in with leaves, flowers, sticks. They're just really cool. So, as I said, I don't blame the Hollow Knight team. If I were developing a society with characters based on mantises, I definitely want to do more of them than to just keep them apart all the time for the sake of real-world accuracy, which is exactly what I'm doing. I've been working on a story for a couple years now that focuses on an alien species inspired by Mantidea, so, well, I can't really call this a shameless plug since the story's not done and I don't really have much I can actually show right now, but if you subscribe to my channel, maybe in 6 months or so I'll have a fun and cool story featuring mantis-inspired creatures to share with you. Anyways, Hollow Knight has some pretty cool designs, and now that Silksong is out, we've gotten even more. I'm still playing through the game as I write this script, so I'm just gonna paste whatever comparisons I find interesting on screen, since hopefully by the time I'm editing this video, I will have finished the game. Another piece of media that takes place in a bug-themed world is Bug Fables, a story-driven RPG about 3 bugs that go on an adventure to find an all-powerful seed, and it's really good. Just go play it. I promise you will have so much fun. The gameplay is so good, and the characters are really, really charming, and I honestly just want more people to know about this game. I feel like it does not get talked about nearly as much as it should. But anyways, the game incorporates more insect inspiration than Hollow Knight, I'd say, as in, it's pretty easy to figure out what characters are inspired by what creatures. So that being said, I don't really want to spend that much time going through the real-world correlates of these characters. I'll mention my personal favorites though, which are Malthiva and the Wasp King. The bees are also super cute. Vi, despite her aggressive demeanor, is just really adorable, and even if she's problematic at times, I can't hold her accountable. I also appreciate the accuracy with the Termite King and Queen. Real-life Termite Queens are massive compared to Termite Kings. It's honestly comical, like here's a side-by-side image. And yes, termite colonies, unlike most other insect colonies which only have a queen, also actually have a king that manages to survive past mating and helps support long-term colony well-being. But back to Bug Fables, the other colonies like the ants and the honeybees only have a queen, which is accurate to real life. The Wasp Kingdom, however, has a king, which seems inaccurate at first until you learn that he's actually a wasp mimic fly who usurped the queen and has been using a fancy crown to artificially control the hive. Wasp mimic flies, or syrphids, are real insects that have similar patterning to wasps that, in theory, help them ward off predators, even though they're actually harmless. It can be hard to tell them apart from real wasps sometimes, but you can usually figure it out by how they fly. Wasp mimics tend to hover, while true wasps do not. Or if you somehow manage to pin them down, you can count the number of wings they have. Flies only have 1 pair of wings, while wasps and bees have 2 pairs. I also just generally appreciate this game for acknowledging that bees and wasps are separate types of insects. I feel like most media just kind of labels any flying bug that's black and yellow as bee, which I suppose that's fair in the sense that I don't know how much the general public actually cares about these distinctions, but I don't know, I do feel like in some ways it's important to acknowledge. Wasps are significantly more aggressive than bees, so it actually might be good for more people to know they're different, like for safety and stuff. So yeah, beehives tend to be yellow with a hexagonal build, and bees generally won't get aggressive unless you go out of your way to harm them. On the other hand, wasps are very territorial and may sting you just for getting too close to their hive, which unfortunately do vary more in appearance, but generally speaking, the above ground hives look white and papery, while the below ground hives look, well, like a hole in the ground with a bunch of wasps buzzing around the entrance. Those are probably the harder ones to look out for, but hopefully now you're at least a little better equipped. Towards the end of this game, there's a character in your main party who turns out to actually be a sentient fungi that reanimated a dead moth's body. This idea was likely inspired by Orpheocordyceps, a real-life fungus capable of infecting and altering insect behavior. This fungus has served as the driving force behind many popular zombie stories over the years. If you don't know though, Orpheocordyceps is a fungus that can hijack insect brains and force them to crawl to high places where the fungus can then grow and mature inside their bodies before sprouting to spread their spores. It's pretty gruesome. I do think it's important to note though that these fungi are very species specific, mainly infecting carpenter ants. They can technically infect other insects like moths, but even then they don't alter their behavior in any way. They just kill them over time like any other infectious fungus would, so in that sense, Bug Fables is not entirely accurate. But I've talked a lot about games, so let's talk about movies, starting with Pixar's A Bug's Life. It's literally about bugs. Insects were chosen because they fit the CGI limitations better than the other ideas Pixar had at the time, so the choice of going with that kind of story was more of a technical thing. But also, the writers were inspired by the classic fable, The Ant and the Grasshopper. In the story, a grasshopper lazes about all summer while mocking the ants for storing food for the winter. When winter comes though, and the grasshopper doesn't have any food, he asks the ants for some, who refuse to give it to him. The story is supposed to be a cautionary tale about the dangers of being unprepared and refusing to think long term, but the writers of A Bug's Life pointed out that the cricket, being larger than the ants, could have probably gotten away with just taking their food. And that's how the story was conceived. There were a lot of liberties taken, of course. This movie is definitely not the most accurate with its biological correlates. For example, there are male worker ants, which is not accurate to real life since all worker ants are female. That's actually an inaccuracy that's been present in all the media I've talked about so far. Save for termite colonies, most insect colonies have exclusively female workers. I didn't really feel like talking about that in depth though, since it's pretty common knowledge, and also it's kind of obvious why storytellers wouldn't want to stay accurate to that. I feel like having an all-female cast would be kind of limiting in terms of storytelling and also just unrelatable to viewers. Another thing about A Bug's Life is that the royal ants have wings, and while it is true that queen ants in real life have wings, they only have them when the colony is large enough to branch off into a new one. In this scenario, an immature queen will fly off to mate with a male ant from another colony, then settle and find a place to begin her own, where she will subsequently shed her wings since she no longer needs them. Another inaccuracy is that crickets don't really interact with, let alone bully, other insects. Look, I don't mean to be weird and nitpicky with all these comparisons. I'm well aware that choices are made as they are for the sake of telling a compelling story. The movie is still really fun, and I'll probably revisit it now and then. But moving on, I actually decided to watch the movie Ants for this video just to see how it fared in terms of its accuracy. I had never seen the movie before. I only knew about the drama that surrounded its production, in that it was basically produced out of spite by DreamWorks founder Katzenberg, who was convinced that Disney was trying to snub the success of The Prince of Egypt by releasing A Bug's Life so close to its release date. Under that belief, he decided to crunch production of Ants so that it'd come out 6 weeks before A Bug's Life, a move that unfortunately didn't really work out in his favor. While the movie did turn a profit in the box office, A Bug's Life still fared better overall, making 3 times its own budget and double the box office revenue of Ants. But that's enough about the meta. The movie itself was fine. I'm not going to do a whole review since that's not the focus of this video. I'm just going to share that this was an actual real line said by the main character. Anyways, the movie isn't super accurate to real-life ants, but it does do some things better than A Bug's Life. For one, the ants have 6 limbs here, whereas in A Bug's Life they only had 4. This was about the only way in which I consider the CGI in this movie to be more impressive, because otherwise it looks kind of terrible even for its time. In the bar scene, the ants are seen drinking from aphid posteriors, which is a thing ants do in real life. Aphids produce honeydew for ants, who in turn protect them from predators. This actually showed up in A Bug's Life too, in that the queen has a pet aphid, although we never see her drink from it. An inaccuracy of ants, though, is that in real life, ants are not nearly so coordinated as to conglomerate and form wrecking balls to get stuff done. Although, fire ants do form rafts in instances of floating so the colony can survive until it reaches higher ground. Ants displays a caste system in which the colony is split into workers and soldiers who even look physically different from one another. This is accurate to some real-life species of ants, in which members are split into different groups with different jobs that are reflected in their phenotype. The last movie I want to talk about is Bee Movie. Starting with the opening monologue, the statement that humans don't know why bees can fly is false, since at the time, we were really only confused about bumblebees specifically. In addition, during the foraging scene, we see the so-called pollen jocks target all the flowers at once before moving on to a different area. This isn't accurate, since in real life, honeybees will actually commit to pollinating one flower species in an area before moving on to the next flower species, which is beneficial to the reproduction of plants, since pollination doesn't result in propagation if it's between different species. Another inaccuracy is that Barry, the main character, refers to the other bees as his cousins, when in reality the females would actually all be his half-sisters since they all share the same mother, and the males would be his full brothers since male honeybees rise from unfertilized eggs, meaning that they all only share the same singular parent, the queen. The movie does get some things right, though, like the idea that using a stinger will kill a honeybee. This is true since stingers are attached to a honeybee's internal organs, so when the stinger gets lodged into a victim's skin, it will detach from the honeybee and pull off some of its body parts with it, which almost always leads to death. The best thing this movie gets right, though, and something I think it should genuinely be appreciated for, is showing the ecological collapse that would result if bees were to just stop pollinating. It really isn't exaggerating when it presents how quickly crops and natural flora would die out, so despite the meme status of this movie, that part should actually be taken seriously. Also, I think this movie's unironically funny. No, I don't take feedback. But confining our discussion of insect inspirations and pop culture just to media that's explicitly bug-themed would be kind of boring, because there are lots of other things about insects that have made a lasting impact on storytelling that are worth talking about, like their social dynamics, individual behaviors, and biological abilities. I think the most popular example, and personally the one I find the most interesting, is the idea of hive minds. Now, this concept isn't limited to insects. If you've ever witnessed a large flock of birds or a school of fish, it almost seems like they move and think as one, but the manners in which this sort of hive mind behavior works varies quite a bit between vertebrates and invertebrates, and hive mind behavior is generally better understood within insects. Basically, insects, like ants, have advanced chemoreceptors on their bodies that can detect secretions from their peers. These secretions are called pheromones, with different pheromones communicating different things like the location of food, the presence of danger, and the desire for certain social behaviors. When hundreds of thousands of insects are all doing this at once, it makes for some pretty interesting collective behavior. That being said, the way hive minds are presented in pop culture is pretty inaccurate. True hive minds, as in one where a group of separate entities are able to communicate with each other through some shared psychic link, doesn't actually exist. It's a cool idea though, and I totally get why people decide to go with it in their stories. For example, in the Enderverse series, the aliens the humans battle against are called the Formics, which, if you know your Latin, you'll know is a reference to ants. The Formics operate under a complete hive mind in which the queen is the only sentient creature, and the remaining members of the colony are complex, but ultimately expendable extensions of her consciousness. There are multiple queens among the Formics, but overall, the number of actual sentient beings within their species is significantly lower than that of humans because of this hive mind property. This ends up being a significant point of conflict in the story, so I won't get into it too much in case someone wants to read the series for themselves. Another interesting usage of the hive mind idea is in the Remembrance of Earth's Past series. This book series features an alien civilization called the Trisolarans that communicate through light, and as a result do not have a separation between what they think in private and communicate in public, since everything that crosses their mind is immediately projected into the physical world. It creates an interesting dynamic in which groups of them can come together and temporarily enter a synchronized state of thinking, in which all their thought projections occupy the same space, and they can explore ideas and solve problems in complete unity. The last example of this I want to talk about is in Hollow Knight, which actually has more than one instance of a hive mind, and in fact, the opposition between said hive minds actually ends up being the driving conflict of the narrative. I'm not going to dive deep into the lore of it all, simply because it would take too long and there are better channels for that sort of thing, but long story short, in this world, moths used to unite in a dream realm to worship the Radiance, a cooler moth I guess, but then the Pale King, who is a creature known as a worm with a Y, showed up and granted bugs sentience and the ability for individual consciousness so long as they remained within his kingdom. This ended up pulling bugs away from the Radiance, who didn't take the rejection very well, retaliating by infecting bugs' dreams and slowly driving them into a sort of single-minded zombie-like state. Overall, I'd say the presentation of hive minds in Hollow Knight is pretty par for the course in the grand scheme of hive minds in media, but I think what really makes it stand out is just the exploration of what might happen when two opposing hive minds with clearly different modes of operating encounter one another. We can see the influence of other insect behaviors in this game too, although they tend to appear on a more individualized basis. As mentioned before, the moth tribe used to literally dedicate themselves to the pursuit of the light, aka the Radiance, which yeah, it's not really hard to figure out where that idea may have come from. There's also characters like the Dung Defender, whose boss fight literally includes rolling up balls of excrement. Again, not hard to figure out where that idea came from. The last thing I want to talk about is the use of bugs in horror. Generally speaking, people do not like the creepy crawlies. In fact, arachnophobia is one of the top 5 most common phobias in the world, and it's estimated that between 3 to 10% of people have it. That being said, the use of bugs in horror is not surprising. Some horror stories are actually entirely centered around using insects and arachnids as antagonists, like the Swarm, the Bay, Mimic, Fragment, etc. Other stories, even if not entirely focused on bugs, still utilize them to up the stakes or establish a certain tone. For example, in the Black Mirror episode Hated in the Nation, synthetic bees are hijacked and used to kill quote-unquote problematic individuals, which becomes an absolutely terrifying situation since these synthetic insects are literally everywhere and really good at sneaking around. Another example is the insect chasm in the 2005 King Kong movie. I don't have much to say about it besides you have to watch the scene for yourself. Or don't. Yeah, you know what? Maybe don't. Some movies don't explicitly use real-life insects as antagonists, but rather rely more on insect-inspired character designs to evoke the creeps. I think about the Boogeyman in Nightmare Before Christmas, who was literally an animated sack of bugs. I also think about King Candy from Wreck-It Ralph at the end of the movie when he fuses with the Cybug. I think the best example, though, is the other mother from Coraline. As the movie goes on, she becomes increasingly less humanoid until the end when she just straight up turns into this spider creature thing. It's really intimidating and very visually effective. So, despite the fact that bugs are sometimes cool, they're also sometimes genuinely dangerous, and the collective fear humanity has developed around them has not been lost on storytellers who are very much willing to take advantage of people's aversion to our crawling cohabitants. Anyways, there was definitely other media I considered talking about in this video, but I had kind of a hard time fitting it into the script, either because of it just not flowing well with everything else, or because I wasn't that familiar with the media myself. For example, I'm aware that the Pikmin of the Pikmin games are inspired by ants, but I've never played a Pikmin game myself, so I can't really talk much about it. I'm also aware that Pokemon was inspired by the creator's insect collecting hobby as a child, which can be seen in the gameplay and the character designs of some Pokemon, but I've never played any of the games myself or watched the shows, so I also can't really comment much about that. Which I guess makes this the end of the video. I definitely missed some stuff, so if there's anything I didn't mention that you think is relevant and interesting to the topic at hand, let me know in the comments. I'm always looking for more media recommendations, and it's cool when multiple interests of mine overlap to make up one thing. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and checking out some of my other content. Bye!